What remained unsaid? In the early mornings, before the town had quite gathered itself into motion, Margaret Ellison would sit at the small wooden table near the kitchen window, and allow the day to arrive without urging it forward, her hands wrapped loosely around a cup of tea that cooled faster than she ever expected, as though time itself moved differently now, thinner somehow, less anchored to purpose. The window, which had not been replaced since long before her husband died, carried a faint distortion in the lower pane, bending the view of the street into a quiet wavering that Margaret had come to rely on more than she realized, because it softened the edges of things, passing cars, a neighbour's dog, even the mailman's steady gait, until they seemed less insistent, less real. Oliver, her grey cat, would usually be there before her, curled into a shape that suggested both sleep and a kind of watchfulness, his breathing shallow but regular, his presence steady in a way that required nothing from her. Sometimes he lifted his head when she moved, his pale eyes blinking as though measuring the room again, confirming that everything remained where it should be. Margaret often found comfort in that small ritual of recognition, though she could not have said exactly why. The house itself held its silence carefully. It was not an empty silence, not the kind that echoed, but something denser, layered with years of footsteps and voices that had gradually withdrawn. Even now certain boards creaked in predictable places, announcing her passage from kitchen to hallway to the narrow staircase that led upstairs, and sometimes she paused on those steps, not out of hesitation exactly, but as though she were listening for something that never quite arrived. She had lived here for nearly 40 years, long enough that the house had become less a structure than a continuation of her own thinking. The cupboards opened with the same reluctant sigh they always had, the back door stuck slightly in damp weather, and the attic, though she rarely entered it, remained a place she thought about more than she visited, like a memory kept intact by distance. After her husband died, people had asked if she planned to move. The question had come gently, often accompanied by concern that hovered just beneath politeness, but Margaret had always answered in the same quiet way, saying that she preferred to stay. It was not stubbornness, though perhaps it appeared that way. It was simply that the house held a version of her life that felt complete, even if she no longer understood all of it. That morning, as she watched a pale line of light spread across the street, she became aware of a faint sound above her, something subtle like a shift or settling. It was not unusual. The house had always made such noises. Still, she found herself listening more closely than usual, her hand tightening slightly around the cup. Oliver lifted his head then, his ears turning toward the ceiling, and for a moment the two of them remained still, sharing that quiet awareness. When nothing followed, the cat lowered his head again, though not entirely back into sleep. Margaret stood after a while, rinsed her cup, and moved through the house with the same measured pace she carried into most things now, pausing briefly at the foot of the attic stairs. The door there was narrow, painted years ago in a shade that had since dulled into something indistinct, neither white nor grey. She rested her hand against it, feeling the faint coolness of the wood, and then, almost without deciding, she opened it. The stairs were steeper than she remembered, or perhaps she was simply more aware of them now, of the way each step required attention, the way her hand naturally reached for the railing. The air above was different, drier, carrying the faint scent of dust and old paper, a smell that was not unpleasant, but carried with it a sense of time that had settled and remained undisturbed. The attic was dim, though a small window at the far end allowed a thin wash of light to enter, catching on suspended dust and giving the space a kind of quiet depth. Boxes were arranged in uneven stacks, some labelled in her own handwriting, others left anonymous. A chair stood near the wall, its seat covered with a folded blanket she did not immediately recognize. She had not intended to search for anything in particular. In fact, she had not intended to come up at all. Yet once there, she felt a subtle shift in herself, as though something long deferred had gently insisted on being acknowledged. She moved slowly, her fingers brushing against the surfaces of boxes as she passed, leaving faint trails in the dust. The act of touching them brought with it fragments of recollection, holidays, school years, objects once deemed important enough to keep. But there was also a distance in those memories now, a sense that they belonged to someone she had once been, rather than to the person standing there. Near the window, partially obscured by a stack of old linens, she noticed a smaller box, narrower than the others. It was not labelled. That, more than anything, drew her attention. She knelt with some effort, pulling it forward. The lid lifted easily, releasing a slightly stronger scent of paper, age but intact. Inside there were a few loose items, a scarf she recognized faintly, a bundle of letters tied with a thin ribbon, and beneath them a book. It was not large. Its cover, once perhaps a deep blue, had faded unevenly, and the edges showed signs of wear that suggested frequent handling. Margaret held it for a moment before opening it, aware of a quiet hesitation she could not fully explain. When she did open it, the handwriting was immediately familiar. She did not need to read a name to know whose it was. Her mother's writing had always carried a certain clarity, each letter formed with care, as though even the act of writing required a kind of discipline that Margaret had both admired and in some quieter way resisted. Evelyn Carter had been a woman of order. That was how Margaret had understood her for most of her life, not cold exactly, but contained, guided by principles that seemed both steady and unquestionable. There had been comfort in that, a sense that the world, though often uncertain, could be held together by the right kind of attention. Margaret sat back slightly, the diary resting open in her lap, though her eyes had not yet moved beyond the first page. Behind her, the house remained quiet. After a moment, she closed the book again, not abruptly, but with a kind of care that suggested she was placing something back into balance, even if only temporarily. Oliver, she realized, had followed her part way up the stairs, and now sat just inside the doorway, watching. "Well," she said softly, though the words seemed less like speech and more like an acknowledgment of something that had already begun. She did not take the diary downstairs immediately. Instead, she remained there for a while longer, aware of the light shifting slightly in the attic, aware of her own breathing, and of a faint persistent sense that something small, perhaps, but definite, had changed. It was not until the afternoon that Margaret returned to the diary, though she carried it with her from room to room for some time before deciding where to sit, as though the choice of place might determine how the reading would unfold, or perhaps how much she would allow herself to understand. She settled finally in the living room, in the chair near the lamp that she turned on, even though there was still daylight, preferring the contained circle of light it offered. Oliver climbed onto the arm of the chair, his body pressing lightly against her shoulder, before settling into stillness. The house held its usual quiet, though it seemed now to contain something else as well, not a presence exactly, but a kind of expectancy that Margaret could feel without naming. She opened the diary again. The first entries were ordinary in a way that almost surprised her. Dates written carefully at the top of each page, observations about the weather, brief mentions of errands, of meals prepared and tasks completed. There was a steadiness to it, a rhythm that mirrored the life Margaret remembered, orderly, composed, without excess. Yet even in those early pages, there were moments, small, almost incidental, that felt different. A sentence paused longer than expected. A word underlined, though lightly, a remark that seemed to trail into something unspoken. Margaret found herself reading more slowly than she usually did, her attention drawn not only to what was written, but to what seemed to gather around it, the spaces between lines, the slight shifts in tone that suggested something just beyond articulation. At one point, her mother had written about a visit from a neighbour, describing the conversation in precise terms, noting the exact phrasing of a compliment, the arrangement of cups on the table. It was all so carefully observed that Margaret felt unexpectedly a kind of distance from it, as though the clarity itself concealed something. She paused, her hand resting lightly on the page. Oliver stirred slightly, adjusting his position. Outside a car passed, its sound softened by the window. Margaret continued reading. As the entries moved forward, there were subtle changes, nothing dramatic, no sudden revelations or confessions, but a quiet accumulation of detail that began to suggest a life less certain than the one Margaret had known. Her mother mentioned moments of hesitation, a decision reconsidered, a feeling described not as certainty, but as something closer to doubt. Margaret found herself unsettled by this, though she could not have said why. It was not that the entries contradicted what she remembered. Rather, they complicated it, adding layers that had not been visible before. She had always believed that her mother moved through life with a kind of assurance, guided by principles that left little room for uncertainty. That belief had shaped Margaret's understanding not only of her mother, but of her own past, her own choices. Now, as she read, that understanding shifted slightly, like the view through the old window in the kitchen, still recognizable, but no longer entirely stable. There was one entry, written in a slightly tighter hand, that held her attention longer than the others. It described an evening, nothing remarkable on the surface, a meal, a conversation, the closing of the day. Yet there was a sentence near the end, brief and unadorned, that Margaret read several times before allowing herself to move on. I sometimes think, her mother had written, that what we call certainty is only the absence of a question we are not ready to ask. Margaret closed the diary then, her fingers remaining on the cover. The room felt unchanged, and yet not. She became aware of the lamp's light, of the way it fell across the rug, of the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. These were things she had always known, always noticed in passing, but now they seemed to carry a different weight, as though they were part of something larger that she had only just begun to perceive. She did not immediately return to the attic, nor did she put the diary away. Instead, she placed it on the table beside her chair and sat for a long time without moving, her thoughts not forming into anything clear, but shifting slowly, like something settling into a new shape. Oliver remained beside her, his presence steady. At some point, the light outside began to fade, and the room grew dim beyond the reach of the lamp. Margaret rose then, moving through the house with a quiet attentiveness, turning on lights as she went, though she left some rooms in shadow, as she often did. In the kitchen, she prepared a simple meal, her movements practiced, almost automatic. Yet even here, in the familiar sequence of actions, there was a subtle awareness that accompanied her, a sense that the day had not ended in the way she expected. After she ate, she returned to the living room, her eyes resting briefly on the diary before she sat down again. She did not open it, not yet. Instead, she listened to the house, to the faint sounds beyond it, to the quiet rhythm of her own breathing. It occurred to her then, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility, that what she had found was not simply a record of her mother's life, but something that might ask something of her in return. The thought did not alarm her, but neither did it leave her entirely at ease. Outside, the street had grown still, and in that stillness Margaret sat, aware of the diary beside her, aware of the way it seemed to wait, not urgently, not insistently, but with a patience that felt somehow inevitable. In the morning, the diary seemed at once familiar and slightly misplaced, as though it had settled into the room during the night without entirely belonging to it, and Margaret, standing in the doorway of the living room, with her hand resting lightly against the frame, felt a brief hesitation before stepping inside, not because she feared what it contained, but because she sensed, in a way that resisted clear thought, that continuing to read it would require something from her that she had not yet decided to give. The light that entered through the window was softer than the day before, diffused by a thin layer of cloud that flattened the shadows and gave the room a muted, almost suspended quality, as if time had slowed just enough to become noticeable. Oliver was already awake, seated on the rug near the chair where Margaret had left the diary, his body arranged with a kind of quiet precision, his gaze directed not at her, but at the table itself. "Well?" she said again, though this time the word carried less uncertainty and more acknowledgment, as though she were responding to something that had already taken shape. She moved toward the chair, her steps measured, aware of the faint creak in the floorboards beneath her feet, a sound that had always been part of the house, but which now seemed to mark each movement with a quiet emphasis. When she sat, the cushion gave slightly, releasing a faint scent of fabric and age that she associated with long afternoons and unspoken thoughts. For a moment, she did not reach for the diary. Instead, she looked around the room, allowing her eyes to rest on objects she had seen countless times. The small frame photograph on the shelf, the folded blanket draped over the back of the sofa, the lamp with its slightly uneven shade. These things, once part of a seamless whole, now appeared to her with a subtle distinctness, as though they had separated themselves just enough to be noticed again. It occurred to her, not for the first time, that memory often worked in this way, not as a continuous thread, but as a series of moments that gained clarity only when something disrupted their arrangement. She picked up the diary then, her fingers tracing briefly along its worn edge before opening it to the place where she had stopped. The entries that followed were not immediately different, yet Margaret found herself reading them with a heightened attention, aware now of the possibility that each line might carry more than it revealed at first glance. Her mother wrote of ordinary days, of laundry hung in the yard, of meals prepared, of letters received and answered. But within these accounts there were small deviations, slight turns in phrasing that suggested a mind moving in parallel with the actions described. In one entry, Evelyn mentioned a walk taken alone in the late afternoon. The description was simple, almost spare, noting the sound of gravel underfoot, the way the light had shifted as the sun lowered. Yet at the end there was a sentence that lingered. I found myself pausing near the old oak, she had written, though I could not say what I expected to find there. Margaret read the sentence again, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of something she could not fully place. Her mother had never spoken of such pauses, such moments of uncertainty, or if she had, Margaret had not understood them as such. She had always remembered her mother as someone who moved forward with intention, whose actions carried a clarity that left little room for hesitation. And yet here, in this quiet record, there were indications, small but persistent, that something else had existed alongside that clarity. Margaret shifted in her chair, adjusting her position as though the act of reading required a different kind of physical balance. Oliver rose then, stepping lightly onto her lap before settling again, his weight familiar, grounding. "Are you comfortable there?" she murmured, though the question seemed directed as much toward herself as towards the cat. She continued reading. As the morning passed, the entries grew incrementally more reflective, though never overtly so. Evelyn did not write in the language of confession. There were no declarations, no explicit acknowledgments of regret or longing. Instead, there were moments, brief, often embedded within otherwise ordinary descriptions, that suggested an awareness of something unresolved. A conversation recalled with unusual precision, a decision described without its outcome, a feeling noted but not explained. Margaret found herself increasingly aware of the tension between what was written and what remained unspoken, and it was this tension, more than any specific detail, that began to unsettle her. She closed the diary again, not out of fatigue, but because she felt the need to step back from it, to allow what she had read to settle into a shape she could begin to understand. Rising from the chair, she moved to the window, her hand resting lightly against the glass. The street outside was quiet, a few leaves shifting along the pavement in a movement that seemed both random and deliberate. She thought of her mother then, not as she had appeared in memory, composed and certain, but as she now emerged from the pages of the diary, a woman who observed, who paused, who questioned in ways that had never been visible. The realization did not come as a shock. It came slowly, like light adjusting in a room, revealing details that had always been present but unnoticed. Margaret remained there for some time, her thoughts moving without resolution, until the sound of a car approaching broke the stillness. She turned slightly, watching as it slowed and came to a stop outside the house. Daniel Harper stepped out, his movements unhurried, his posture carrying the same quiet steadiness she had come to associate with him over the years. He did not look toward the window immediately. Instead, he stood for a moment beside the car, as though orienting himself to the day, before walking toward the side of the house. Margaret felt, unexpectedly, a small shift within her, not quite relief, but something close to it. She set the diary down on the table and moved toward the back door. Daniel was already in the yard when Margaret stepped outside, the air carrying a faint coolness that lingered despite the season, and she noticed, as she often did, the way he moved with a kind of deliberate economy, each action measured but unforced, as though he had long ago decided that nothing required more effort than necessary. "I thought I'd take a look at the fence," he said, without turning immediately, his voice steady, low, as if it belonged naturally to the quiet of the place. Margaret followed his gaze. One of the wooden slats near the corner had come loose, tilting slightly inward, something she had noticed days before but had not yet addressed. "It's been like that for a while," she replied, her hands resting loosely at her sides. He nodded, stepping closer to the fence and pressing lightly against the wood, testing his give. "Wood does that," he said after a moment, not all at once, just gradually. There was something in the way he said it, not pointed, not suggestive, that Margaret felt more than understood, and she found herself watching him with a quiet attentiveness, aware of the familiarity of his presence, the way it settled into the space without altering it. Oliver had followed her outside and now sat near the steps, his tail wrapped neatly around his body, observing. Daniel bent slightly, adjusting the loose slat with his hands, his fingers moving with practised ease. He did not speak again for some time, and Margaret did not feel the need to fill the silence. It was one of the things she appreciated about him, that conversations with Daniel did not require continuity. They could begin, pause, and resume without explanation, as though the spaces between words were part of the exchange. "You've been up to the attic?" he said eventually, still focused on the fence. Margaret felt a brief, almost imperceptible tension in her shoulders. "Yes," she said, "yesterday." He nodded again, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "Find anything?" The question was simple, but Margaret hesitated before answering, aware that whatever she said would shape the way the moment settled. "A few things," she replied, "old papers and a diary." Daniel straightened slightly, though he did not turn to face her fully. "Yours?" "No," she said. "My mother's." There was a pause then, not uncomfortable, but marked by a subtle shift in attention. "That can be something," he said after a moment, his tone unchanged, though the words carried a weight that suggested experience rather than assumption. Margaret looked toward the house, her eyes resting briefly on the window of the living room, where the diary lay on the table. "I didn't know she kept one," she said. Daniel brushed his hands lightly against his trousers, as though clearing away something that was no longer there. "People keep things," he said, "even from themselves." Margaret considered this, though she did not respond immediately. The idea seemed both obvious and unfamiliar, like something she had understood once, but had not thought about in a long time. "She was very certain," Margaret said finally, choosing the word with care. "At least that's how I remember her." Daniel glanced at her then, his expression neutral, though his eyes held a quiet attentiveness. "Memory can be like that," he said. "It settles on what makes sense." Margaret felt the words settle somewhere within her, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility she had not yet explored. They stood together for a while longer, the fence now straightened, though not yet secured, the task paused in a way that did not suggest incompletion so much as a natural stopping point. "I'll bring some tools later," Daniel said. "Fix it properly." "Thank you," Margaret replied, though the gratitude extended beyond the fence itself. He nodded, stepping back slightly. As he moved toward the gate, he paused, his hand resting briefly on the wood. "Diaries," he said, almost as an afterthought. "They don't always say what you expect, but they don't usually lie either." Margaret watched him as he left, his figure receding down the quiet street, his pace unhurried. When she turned back toward the house, she felt a subtle shift in her awareness, as though the conversation had altered something she had not yet fully examined. Inside, the diary remained where she had left it. The room was unchanged, the same light, the same arrangement of objects, but Margaret sensed with a quiet certainty that her relationship to it had begun to move, slowly but unmistakably, in a direction she could not yet name. Oliver slipped past her as she entered, returning to his place near the chair. Margaret followed, her steps measured, her attention drawn once more to the diary on the table. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she stood for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, aware of the faint sound of the house settling around her, of the light shifting almost imperceptibly as the afternoon moved forward. Then, with a small deliberate motion, she sat down and reached for the book. Margaret did not open the diary at once, though her hand rested upon it, her fingers lightly curved over the worn cover as if testing its presence, confirming that it remained what she believed it to be and had not, in the quiet interval since she last touched it, altered into something less certain, less contained. The room seemed to hold its breath around her, not in any dramatic way, but with a subtle stillness that made each small movement more noticeable. The shift of fabric as she adjusted in the chair, the faint exhale of the lamp's warmth, the soft, almost imperceptible sound of Oliver settling more firmly against her side. She became aware then of her own reluctance, not fear exactly, but something closer to a resistance that did not wish to be named, because naming it might require her to acknowledge its source. It was easier, in a way, to remain in this pause, where the diary existed as potential rather than fact, where whatever it contained had not yet been fully brought into the light of her understanding. But the thought did not hold. After a moment, she opened the book. The entries she encountered that afternoon carried a different quality, though Margaret could not have said precisely when the shift occurred. It was not marked by any obvious change in tone or subject, but by a gradual deepening, a movement inward that revealed itself only through accumulation. Her mother wrote of a visit into town, describing the arrangement of goods in the store, the brief exchange with the clerk, the weight of a parcel carried home, yet within the description there was a line that seemed to linger beyond its place. I realized, standing there among familiar things, that I no longer knew which of them I had chosen, and which had simply remained. Margaret read the sentence again, her brow tightening slightly, not in confusion, but in a kind of recognition that unsettled her more than she expected. She thought of her own kitchen, of the objects that filled it, the dishes, the utensils, the small worn items that had been used so often they no longer required attention. Had she chosen them, or had they too simply remained? The question did not resolve itself. She turned the page. As the entries continued, Evelyn's writing began to circle certain ideas without fully naming them. There were references to conversations that seemed incomplete, to decisions made without clear explanation, to feelings that hovered at the edge of articulation. In one entry, she described an evening spent in silence, noting only the sound of a clock and the way the light had faded from the room. The description was spare, almost minimal, yet it carried a weight that Margaret felt more than understood. I sat longer than I intended, her mother had written, because leaving would have required me to decide something I was not yet ready to see. Margaret felt a subtle tightening in her chest as she read this, a sensation that was neither entirely unfamiliar nor entirely comfortable. It was as though the words reached towards something within her that had remained until now unexamined. She shifted slightly, her hand moving to rest against Oliver's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The contact grounded her, anchoring her in the present moment even as her thoughts moved elsewhere. There was, she realized, a difference between remembering a person and encountering them in this way. Memory allowed for a certain arrangement, a shaping of events and qualities into something coherent, something that made sense, but the diary resisted that coherence. It presented not a narrative, but a series of moments that did not fully align, that suggested contradictions Margaret had not previously considered. Her mother had been certain. That was what Margaret had always believed. And yet, here, in these pages, there was something else, a hesitation, a questioning, a quiet uncertainty that did not fit easily within the image she had carried for so long. She closed the diary again, though not as she had before. This time the gesture felt less like a pause and more like an acknowledgement that what she had read could not be easily set aside. Rising from the chair, she moved into the kitchen, her steps slower than usual, as though the act of walking required a greater awareness. She filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and stood watching it, though she did not immediately turn on the flame. The room held its familiar arrangement, yet it seemed subtly altered, as though the objects within it had shifted in relation to one another. The table, the chairs, the window, they were all as they had been, and yet Margaret felt, with a quiet certainty, that her understanding of them had changed. When the kettle began to warm, she lit the burner, the small click of the ignition sharp in the otherwise muted space. Oliver appeared in the doorway, his movements unhurried, his gaze directed toward her. "Yes," she said softly, though she had not asked a question. She prepared her tea with the same careful attention she always gave it, measuring the leaves, pouring the water, waiting for the steeping to reach the point she preferred. The ritual steadied her, though it did not entirely dispel the sense that something within her had begun to shift. Carrying the cup back to the living room, she paused at the threshold, her eyes drawn again to the diary on the table. For a moment she considered leaving it there, allowing the day to continue without returning to it, but the thought did not hold. She set the tea down, sat, and opened the book once more. This time she did not hesitate. The light had begun to change by the time Margaret reached the later entries, the afternoon giving way to that quieter part of the day when the house seemed to draw inward, gathering itself into shadow and soft illumination, and she found that the shifting light altered not only the room around her, but the way she read, as though the words themselves carried a different weight when seen in the dimmer glow. Oliver had moved from her lap to the rug, stretching out along its edge, his body elongated in a posture that suggested both ease and a kind of attentive rest, as if he remained, in some subtle way, aware of her. Margaret turned another page. The entry before her was longer than most, the handwriting slightly more compressed, as though her mother had written it without pause, or with a sense that the act of writing itself required a certain urgency, even if that urgency remained contained within the careful formation of each word. It described a day that, on the surface, appeared no different from the others, a series of tasks completed, a brief interaction with someone in town, the preparation of a meal. Yet beneath these details there was a current that Margaret could feel, though she could not immediately name it. About halfway through the entry, Evelyn had written, "I have begun to understand that restraint is not always the same as peace. There are things I have chosen not to say, not because they did not matter, but because I believed that silence would preserve what was already in place. I see now that silence also alters things, though more slowly. Margaret felt the words settle into her with a quiet force. She read the passage again, her eyes moving more slowly this time, as though the meaning might shift if she approached it differently. Her mother had been a woman of restraint. That, too, had been part of the image Margaret carried, a sense of control, of measured response, of emotions kept within clear boundaries. But here, in this sentence, restraint appeared not as a virtue, but as something more complicated, something that carried its own consequences. Margaret leaned back slightly, her gaze lifting from the page to the room beyond it. The lamp's light had deepened, casting longer shadows across the floor. The edges of the furniture seemed less distinct, blending into the dimness in a way that softened their outlines. She thought then of the many conversations she had had with her mother, moments that at the time had seemed complete, sufficient. Had there been things left unsaid? Questions unasked? Or had she, Margaret, simply accepted the silence as part of the natural order of things? The thought lingered. Returning her attention to the diary, she continued reading. The entries that followed did not provide clear answers. Instead, they expanded upon the idea introduced in that earlier passage, circling it from different angles, offering glimpses rather than explanations. There were references to choices made without full understanding, to feelings acknowledged only in retrospect, to a sense of life moving forward even as certain questions remained unresolved. Margaret found herself increasingly aware of a tension that ran through the writing, a tension between the desire to maintain order and the recognition that such order might come at a cost. It was not a dramatic tension. It did not announce itself, but it was there, persistent, shaping the tone of the entries in ways that Margaret could not ignore. At one point, Evelyn described standing at the window in the evening, watching the light fade from the yard. The description was simple, almost spare, yet it carried a weight that extended beyond the moment itself. I thought, for a time, she had written, that clarity would come if I waited long enough. I am no longer certain that waiting changes anything, except the way we learn to live without knowing. Margaret closed the diary then, her hands resting on the cover. The room was very quiet. She became aware of the sound of the clock again, its steady ticking marking the passage of time in a way that felt both constant and newly significant. Oliver lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers briefly before he settled again. Margaret exhaled slowly, though she had not realized she had been holding her breath. There was a part of her that wanted to step away from what she had read, to return to the simpler understanding she had held for so many years. That understanding had been stable, reassuring. It had allowed her to move through her life without questioning the foundations upon which it rested. But the diary had introduced something else, not a contradiction exactly, but a complexity that could not be easily reconciled with what she had believed. She rose from the chair, carrying the diary with her as she moved through the house, turning off the lamp, allowing the room to settle into shadow. In the kitchen, she paused again by the window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, layered over the dim outline of the yard beyond. For a moment, she did not recognize herself, not because her appearance had changed, but because the way she saw herself, her sense of where she stood in relation to her past, had begun, subtly but unmistakably, to shift. She placed the diary on the table, her hand lingering on it for a moment before withdrawing. It occurred to her then that what she was uncovering was not simply her mother's life, but something that extended into her own, something that might require her to reconsider not only who her mother had been, but who she herself had become in relation to that understanding. The realization did not come with clarity. It came as a quiet unease, a sense that the ground beneath her, though still solid, was no longer entirely fixed. Outside, the last of the light had faded, and in the darkness that followed, the house seemed to hold its silence more closely, as though it too was waiting for something to be understood. The following morning arrived without announcement, as it often did, though Margaret sensed it differently now, as if the quiet accumulation of what she had read had altered not the world itself, but her attention to it, and she found that even the smallest details, the way the light gathered along the edge of the table, the faint ticking of the clock before she had fully woken, carried a kind of significance that was difficult to name and yet impossible to ignore. She remained in bed longer than usual, not out of fatigue, but because the act of rising seemed to require a decision she had not yet made. The diary, resting downstairs, existed in her mind, not as an object, but as a continuation, something that would resume the moment she allowed it to, and she understood, in a way that was both clear and incomplete, that continuing to read it meant allowing that quiet shift within her to deepen. Oliver, who had slept at the foot of the bed, stretched slowly, his back arching before he settled again, his eyes half open, watching her with a calm that did not demand response. "Well?" she said after a time, her voice low, as if she were speaking into the stillness rather than to him. When she finally rose, the house greeted her with its usual sequence of sounds, the floorboards responding to her steps, the slight movement of air through the hallway, the distant hum of something she could not immediately place. These sounds had always been there, but now they seemed to form a kind of pattern, a rhythm that accompanied her as she moved through the rooms. In the kitchen, she prepared her tea with the same careful attention, though her movements felt more deliberate, as if each action required confirmation. She noticed the way the kettle's surface reflected the light, the faint tremor in her hand as she poured the water, the subtle shift in the air as the steam rose. She carried the cup into the living room. The diary remained where she had left it, its presence both ordinary and quietly insistent. Margaret sat, though not immediately reaching for it, allowing herself instead to observe the room once more as she had the day before, noting the arrangement of objects, the way the light fell, the slight unevenness of the rug beneath her feet. It occurred to her that nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She picked up the diary. The entries she encountered that morning seemed at first to return to a more familiar tone, descriptions of daily routines, of interactions that carried no apparent weight beyond their occurrence. Yet Margaret had learned by now to read beneath that surface, to attend to the subtle shifts that revealed themselves only through patience. In one entry, Evelyn described a conversation with a friend, recounting it in careful detail, noting the exact phrasing of certain remarks, the pauses between them. It was a precise reconstruction, one that suggested not only memory, but a need to preserve something that might otherwise be lost. She spoke as though everything had already been decided, Evelyn wrote, and I found myself agreeing, though I could not say with certainty that I understood what exactly had been settled. Margaret felt a quiet stirring at this, a recognition that was not fully formed. How many times, she wondered, had she done the same, agreed not out of conviction, but because the alternative required a question she was not prepared to ask. She turned the page. As the entries progressed, there were moments, brief, almost incidental, that suggested a growing awareness in her mother, a movement towards something that remained just out of reach, a hesitation before answering a question, a remark left unfinished, a decision described in terms that avoided its consequences. Margaret found herself increasingly aware of the spaces within the writing, the gaps where something might have been said, but was not. At one point, Evelyn describes standing in the kitchen late at night, the house quiet around her, much as Margaret now experienced it. "I realized then," she had written, "that there are things we learn to live beside rather than within, because to bring them closer would require us to see them differently." Margaret paused, her fingers resting lightly against the page. The sentence lingered, not because it was dramatic, but because it carried a quiet truth that she felt, though she could not yet fully articulate it. She thought of her own life, of the routine she had maintained, the understanding she had accepted, the memory she had arranged into something that felt coherent and stable. Had she, too, lived beside certain things rather than within them? The question did not resolve. She closed the diary for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the window. Outside the street was still, the morning not yet fully formed into activity. A single leaf moved along the pavement, carried by a breeze too faint to be felt inside. Oliver shifted beside her, his body pressing lightly against her leg. Margaret reached down, her hand resting on his back, feeling the steady warmth beneath her fingers. "Yes," she murmured, though the word held no clear meaning. After a time she opened the diary again, but she read more slowly now, and with a growing awareness that what she was uncovering did not belong solely to the past. That afternoon, Margaret found herself unable to remain inside, though she could not have said what prompted the feeling, only that the house, which had always offered a kind of contained comfort, now seemed to hold her thoughts too closely, as if the walls themselves reflected them back in ways that made them difficult to escape. She left the diary on the table, not as an act of avoidance, but as a temporary release, and stepped outside into the yard, where the air carried a faint dryness, the kind that suggested a shift in the season, though it had not yet fully arrived. The fence stood as Daniel had left it, straightened but not secured, and Margaret paused beside it, her hand resting lightly against the wood. It felt solid enough, though she knew it would not hold indefinitely without repair. There was something in that, she thought, though she did not pursue it. Oliver followed her out, moving slowly across the grass, before settling near the edge of the garden, his body partially hidden among the low plants, his presence marked more by stillness than by motion. Margaret walked along the perimeter of the yard, her steps unhurried, her attention moving from one detail to another. The uneven line of the fence, the slight dip in the ground near the corner, the way the light fell differently here than it did in the front of the house. She had lived in this space for so many years that it had become, in a sense, invisible, its details absorbed into familiarity. Yet now, as she moved through it, she noticed things she had not seen before, or perhaps had seen and forgotten. A small crack in the wooden post, a patch of grass that grew more thinly than the rest, the faint sound of wind moving through the trees beyond the yard. These details did not carry meaning on their own, and yet Margaret felt, as she observed them, that they were part of something larger, a pattern she could not yet discern, but which seemed to connect, in some quiet way, to the thoughts that had begun to gather within her. When she reached the gate, she paused, her hand resting on the latch. For a moment she considered walking beyond it, continuing down the street, perhaps as far as the small store at the corner where she had not been in several days, but the thought did not fully take hold. Instead, she remained where she was, her gaze directed outward, her attention caught between the familiar boundary of the yard and the open space beyond it. After a time she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Daniel appeared at the far end of the path, carrying a small set of tools in one hand. His pace was steady, his expression unchanged, though there was a quiet attentiveness in the way he looked toward the house, as if he had already taken note of her presence before she saw him. "I said I'd come back," he remarked as he reached the gate. "Yes," Margaret replied, stepping aside to allow him in. They moved together toward the fence, their steps falling into a natural rhythm that required no coordination. Daniel set his tools down and began to work, his movements precise, practiced, the sound of hammer against nail sharp, but not intrusive. Margaret stood nearby, watching. There was something reassuring in the act itself, the straightforwardness of it, the way the task moved from one step to the next, without hesitation or doubt. The wood aligned, the nails secured, the structure restored to its intended form. "Won't take long," Daniel said, though Margaret had not asked. She nodded, her eyes following his hands as they worked. After a moment she spoke. "I've been reading it," she said. "The diary." Daniel did not look up immediately, though his movements slowed slightly. "And?" he asked. Margaret hesitated, not because she lacked an answer, but because she did not yet know how to express it. "It's not what I expected," she said finally. He nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already understood. "It usually isn't," he replied. Margaret watched as he adjusted the final slat, securing it with a firm, deliberate motion. "She was different," Margaret continued, her voice quieter now. "Or maybe not different, just—" She paused, searching for the word. "More," she said at last. Daniel leaned back slightly, examining the fence before straightening. "People are," he said simply. The words settled between them, not as an explanation, but as something that did not require one. Margaret looked at the fence, now whole again, its line straight, its structure restored. It appeared as it had before, and yet she knew that something had changed, not in the fence itself, but in her awareness of it, of what it had required to return it to this state. "Thank you," she said. Daniel nodded, gathering his tools. As he turned to leave, he paused briefly, his gaze moving toward the house. "You'll keep reading?" he asked. Margaret followed his gaze, her eyes resting on the window through which the diary could not be seen, but whose presence she felt with quiet certainty. "Yes," she said. Daniel inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging something unspoken, and then he left, his figure moving steadily down the path until he was no longer in view. Margaret remained in the yard for a while longer, her attention returning to the fence, to the garden, to the small familiar details that now seemed to hold a different kind of significance. Oliver emerged from the plants, crossing the grass to stand beside her. "Well?" she said softly, though the word carried less uncertainty now. When she finally returned to the house, the light had begun to fade again, and the rooms greeted her with their usual quiet. The diary waited where she had left it, and this time, when she entered the living room, she did not pause. She went directly to the table and opened it. By the time Margaret resumed reading that evening, the house had already begun its slow transition into night, the kind that did not arrive suddenly, but gathered itself in corners and along edges, softening the outlines of things until they seemed less fixed, more open to interpretation, and she found that this gradual dimming suited her in a way she had not anticipated, as though the uncertainty of the light allowed her to meet the words on the page without demanding immediate clarity from them. She had not turned on the overhead light. Instead, she relied on the lamp beside her chair, its glow contained and steady, casting a small circle that held both her and the diary within it, leaving the rest of the room in a quiet, receptive shadow. Oliver lay nearby, not asleep but still, his presence a kind of constant that Margaret had come to depend on without naming it. She opened the diary to where she had left off. The entries continued in their measured way, yet Margaret sensed almost immediately a shift that felt less gradual than before, not abrupt, but more defined, as though her mother had reached a point where something could no longer be held entirely within the boundaries she had set for herself. The handwriting, though still careful, appeared slightly more compressed, the spacing between lines narrower, as if the act of writing had taken on a different urgency. Evelyn wrote of a series of days that seemed, on the surface, unremarkable. There were references to familiar routines, to interactions that Margaret could easily imagine, having witnessed similar moments herself years before. And yet, within these descriptions, there was a growing sense of inwardness, a turning towards something that was not fully articulated, but increasingly present. In one entry, she described an encounter in town, someone she had not seen in many years. The details were sparse, almost deliberately so, yet the tone suggested that the meeting had carried more weight than the words allowed. We spoke as though no time had passed. Evelyn wrote, though I was aware throughout that what remained unsaid was far greater than what we allowed ourselves to acknowledge. Margaret paused, her eyes resting on the sentence. There was no name given, no indication of who this person had been, and yet the absence itself seemed significant, as though the omission were not accidental but chosen, a boundary maintained even within the private space of the diary. Margaret felt a subtle tightening within her, not of alarm, but of attention. She turned the page. The entries that followed returned, briefly, to a more familiar rhythm, descriptions of meals, of weather, of small contained observations that might have passed without notice had she not already begun to read differently. But the earlier mention lingered. It hovered just beneath the surface of the writing, influencing the tone in ways that Margaret could not ignore. At one point, Evelyn wrote, I find myself thinking of that afternoon more often than I expected, not because of what was said, but because of what it revealed in its absence. Margaret read the sentence again, her fingers pressing lightly against the page. There was something in the phrasing, something restrained yet unmistakably present, that suggested a depth of feeling her mother had never shown, at least not outwardly, and Margaret realized with a quiet unease that she had never considered the possibility that her mother's life contained such moments, encounters that carried meaning beyond the visible, beyond the structured clarity she had always associated with her. She leaned back slightly, her gaze lifting from the diary. The room remained unchanged, the lamp's light steady, the shadows unmoving. And yet Margaret felt more distinctly now that the past she had known was not as complete as she had believed. Returning to the diary, she continued. The entries grew more reflective, though still measured, still contained. Evelyn did not abandon her restraint. She did not suddenly begin to confess or explain. Instead, she allowed certain thoughts to surface more clearly, though never fully. "I have begun to wonder," she wrote in one passage, "whether the life I have lived has been shaped more by what I have chosen to avoid than by what I have chosen to embrace." Margaret felt the words settle into her with a quiet weight. She thought of her own life, of the choices she had made, the path she had followed, the questions she had not asked. The thought did not form into a conclusion. It remained suspended. She closed the diary, though her hand lingered on it, her fingers tracing the edge of the cover, as though seeking something she could not quite identify. There was a part of her that wanted to dismiss what she had read, to return to the simpler understanding she had carried for so long, to re-establish the sense of order that had defined her memory of her mother. But that part felt now less certain. Not gone, but altered. Oliver shifted, rising to stretch before moving closer to her, his body brushing lightly against her leg. Margaret rested her hand on his back, feeling the steady warmth beneath her palm. "Yes," she said softly, though the word carried no clear direction. Outside the night had settled fully, and within it Margaret sat, aware that the distance between what she had believed and what she was beginning to understand was no longer as wide as it once seemed. The next day unfolded with a kind of quiet inevitability, as though the previous evening had set something in motion that could not be easily paused, and Margaret, moving through her morning routine with a heightened awareness, felt that each small action carried with it a subtle continuation of what had begun, even if she could not yet see where it might lead. She did not delay her reading this time. After preparing her tea, she went directly to the living room, the diary already in her hands before she had fully settled into the chair, as if the hesitation that had marked the earlier days had given way to something more steady, more accepting of whatever might emerge. The light was clearer that morning, sharper at the edges, and it revealed the room in a way that felt almost too precise, as though it left less space for the kind of quiet ambiguity she had come to rely on. Oliver took his place beside her without prompting, his presence as consistent as the rhythm of her breathing. Margaret opened the diary. The entry she encountered was dated several weeks after the one she had read the night before, and the gap itself seemed significant, though she could not yet say why. The handwriting remained steady, but there was a difference in the tone, subtle yet unmistakable. Evelyn wrote, "I have decided that not all truths require articulation. There are some that exist fully in their recognition, and to bring them into language would alter them in ways I am not prepared to accept." Margaret felt a faint, almost immediate resistance to this idea, though she could not have explained its source. She read the sentence again, and then again. It suggested a deliberate choice, not merely to remain silent, but to preserve something through that silence. But what, and at what cost? She turned the page. The entries that followed did not clarify the matter. Instead, they seemed to move around it, offering fragments that hinted at a larger context without fully revealing it. There were references to moments of reflection, to evenings spent alone, to thoughts that appeared and then receded without resolution. In one passage, Evelyn described returning home from town and pausing at the door, her hand on the handle, unable to enter immediately. "I stood there longer than I can account for," she wrote, "because I understood in that moment that crossing the threshold would require me to resume a version of myself that no longer felt entirely true." Margaret felt a quiet tightening in her chest as she read this. The image was simple, yet it carried a weight that extended beyond the moment itself. She imagined her mother standing there, suspended between inside and outside, between what was known and what had begun to shift. And for the first time Margaret felt not only curiosity, but something closer to recognition. She thought of her own pauses, moments when she had lingered in doorways, in transitions, without fully understanding why. Had those moments carried the same weight, or had she too moved past them without allowing them to take shape? She continued reading. The entries grew more introspective, though still restrained, still careful not to overstep the boundaries Evelyn had set for herself. "I do not regret what I have chosen," she wrote in one passage, "but I cannot say with the same certainty that I understand it." Margaret closed the diary slowly, her hands remaining on it, as though it required a certain steadiness to hold it now. The room felt different, not visibly, but in a way that suggested a shift in how she occupied it. She became aware of the silence again, not as absence, but as something that contained layers she had not previously noticed. Oliver lifted his head, his gaze meeting hers briefly. Margaret exhaled a long, quiet breath. There was something forming now, not a conclusion, not yet, but a growing awareness that the life she had attributed to her mother, the sense of clarity and order she had relied upon, had been shaped, at least in part, by what had remained unseen. And that realization, though not yet complete, carried with it a quiet, persistent tension. She rose from the chair, moving toward the window. Outside, the street appeared unchanged. A car passed, a neighbour walked by. The world continued, steady, uninterrupted. And yet Margaret felt, with a certainty that did not require explanation, that something within her had begun to shift in a way that would not easily return to what it had been. She rested her hand against the glass, her reflection faintly visible. For a moment she did not look away. Then, slowly, she turned back toward the room. The diary lay where she had left it, waiting, not urgently, but with a quiet persistence that Margaret could no longer ignore. The days had begun to gather into one another in a way that Margaret could not easily separate, not because they lacked distinction, but because each seemed to carry forward something from the one before it, a quiet accumulation that resisted clear boundaries, and she found herself moving through them with a kind of attentiveness that was both deliberate and uncertain, as though she were learning gradually how to inhabit a space that had once been familiar but now revealed itself as something more layered than she had understood. That morning the light entered the house at an angle she did not immediately recognize, falling across the hallway floor in a narrow band that seemed almost intentional, as though it had chosen that particular place to rest, and Margaret paused there longer than necessary, her gaze fixed on the pale strip of brightness, aware of a faint sensation that she might have seen it before and simply not noticed. Oliver brushed past her legs, his tail flicking lightly against her ankle, and the small physical contact drew her back into movement, though not entirely into certainty. She carried the diary with her into the kitchen, setting it on the table while she prepared her tea, and this simple act, bringing it into a different room, felt, in a way she could not explain, like a crossing of some subtle threshold, as though the contents of the diary no longer belonged solely to the contained space of the living room, but had begun to extend into the broader fabric of her daily life. The kettle began to hum softly, and Margaret stood watching it, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter. She had reached a point, she realized, where reading the diary no longer felt like an act of discovery alone, but something closer to an engagement, a participation in a process that required her not only to observe but to respond, though she did not yet know how that response might take shape. When she finally sat, the chair at the kitchen table felt different from the one in the living room, firmer, less yielding, and the diary placed before her seemed to hold a different weight, as though its presence had shifted along with its surroundings. She opened it. The entry she encountered began without preamble, the handwriting steady, but more compressed than she had seen before, the lines drawn closer together, as if space itself had become something to be managed. "I've come to understand," Evelyn wrote, "that there are certain truths which do not reveal themselves fully until they have already altered the course of what we believe to be settled." Margaret felt the words settle into her with a quiet force, not because they were unexpected, but because they seemed to articulate something she had begun, only faintly, to sense. She read on. The entry described a period of time that Margaret could place, roughly, within her own memory, a season marked by its ordinariness, by routines that had appeared, at the time, unremarkable and complete. There were references to familiar details, the arrangement of the house, the rhythm of meals, the small repeated gestures that formed the structure of daily life, and yet, within these descriptions, there was a current that Margaret had not perceived then, a subtle underlayer that now, through the diary, became visible. Evelyn wrote of a conversation that had taken place in the house itself. The description was brief, almost restrained to the point of absence. "There are moments," she noted, "when one is offered the opportunity to speak differently, to alter the direction of what is already in motion. I recognized such a moment, and I chose not to take it." Margaret's hand tightened slightly on the edge of the table. She read the sentence again. There was no indication of what had been said, or what might have been said instead. No names, no context, only the acknowledgement of a choice, one that had been recognized and declined. Margaret felt then a quiet but unmistakable shift within her, as though something she had long held in place had loosened, not entirely, but enough to reveal a gap she had not previously seen. She tried to recall that time, to place the moment within her own memory, but nothing surfaced with clarity. There had been so many conversations, so many ordinary exchanges that had seemed at the time complete in themselves. Had she been present? Had she been part of it? Or had it occurred in a space she had not occupied, in a silence she had not recognized? The questions did not resolve. She continued reading. The entry moved forward, circling the moment without returning to it directly, as though the act of naming it had been sufficient, and further elaboration unnecessary. "I believed," Evelyn wrote, "that maintaining what existed was the greater kindness. I am no longer certain that kindness and preservation are always aligned." Margaret closed the diary then, her hands resting flat against its cover, as if to steady both it and herself. The kitchen seemed unusually still. The kettle, long since cooled, sat silent on the stove. Outside, a faint breeze moved through the yard, stirring the leaves in a way that Margaret could see but not hear. She remained there for a long time, her thoughts moving slowly, not toward a conclusion, but toward an awareness that felt both incomplete and unavoidable. At some point, Oliver jumped onto the chair beside her, his body settling with a soft, familiar weight, and Margaret reached out, her hand resting against his back. "Yes," she said quietly, though she could not have said what she was answering. The diary remained closed, but it did not feel distant. That evening, Margaret returned to the living room, bringing the diary with her, as she had begun to do without thinking, and the movement itself carried a quiet significance, as though she were no longer deciding where it belonged, but allowing it to move with her through the spaces of the house, becoming in some subtle way part of the life that continued around it. The light had faded early, the sky overcast in a way that absorbed what little brightness remained, and the room held a deeper shadow than usual, though the lamp provided its steady circle of illumination within which Margaret sat, the diary open once more in her lap. Oliver lay at her feet, his body partially curled, his presence less active now, but no less steady. She turned to the next entry. The handwriting was unchanged, yet there was something in the tone, something that Margaret felt almost immediately, that suggested a point of convergence, as though the thoughts that had been gathering across previous pages had reached a place where they could no longer remain entirely separate. "I have tried," Evelyn wrote, "to understand whether the life I have lived has been shaped more by what I feared to disrupt than by what I wish to become." Margaret's breath caught slightly, though she did not move. She continued reading. The entry unfolded with a clarity that differed from those before it, not because it explained more, but because it allowed certain connections to surface, even if they remained incomplete. Evelyn wrote of the same unnamed encounter mentioned earlier, though again without details that would fix it in place. "There was a time," she noted, "when I believed that the past could be left intact simply by refusing to revisit it. I see now that the past does not require our attention in order to persist. It remains, altering the present in ways we do not always recognize." Margaret felt a quiet, almost physical sensation at this, as though the words had reached beyond thought and settled somewhere deeper, somewhere less easily articulated. She thought of the diary itself, of its presence in her life now, of the way it had begun to shift her understanding, not only of her mother, but of her own past, her own choices. The past does not require our attention in order to persist. The sentence remained with her, even as she read on. Toward the end of the entry, there was a passage that Margaret read more than once, her eyes moving slowly across the lines, as though the meaning might change if she allowed it enough time. "I have come to accept," Evelyn wrote, "that the life others believe I have lived is not untrue, but it is not complete. There are parts of it that exist only in what was not said, not done, not altered. I do not know if those parts diminish what is visible, or if they are in some way the more honest record." Margaret closed the diary, but this time the gesture felt different from before. Not a pause, not a step back, but a recognition that she had reached a point beyond which the act of reading could no longer remain separate from the act of understanding. She sat very still. The room seemed to recede slightly, the edges of the furniture softening in the lamplight, the familiar arrangement of objects losing some of its solidity, as though it too had become subject to reconsideration. She became aware of her own breathing, slow, measured, and of the faint, almost imperceptible sound of Oliver shifting on the rug. There was a realization forming, not sudden, not fully defined, but undeniable in its presence. Her mother's life had not been the fixed, certain thing Margaret had believed it to be. It had contained hesitation, choice, silence, and perhaps, most significantly, moments in which something might have been different, but was not. Margaret felt then a quiet and unexpected sense of distance from the version of the past she had carried for so many years, as though it had been placed slightly out of reach, not removed, but altered in its relation to her. She rose from the chair, moving slowly toward the window. Outside, the darkness was complete, the yard no longer visible except as a faint suggestion beyond the glass. She rested her hand against the pane, her reflection faint and indistinct. For a moment she did not recognize the expression she saw there, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it carried something she had not yet named. Behind her, the diary lay closed, but its presence remained, not as an object, but as a question that had begun, quietly and without resolution, to reshape the way she understood what had come before. And though she did not yet fully realize it, what might still follow? The realization did not arrive all at once, nor did it present itself as something that could be clearly named, and yet Margaret felt, as she moved through the following morning, that something within her had settled into a new arrangement, not entirely stable, but no longer as uncertain as it had been, as though the gradual accumulation of what she had read had reached a point where it could no longer remain suspended without consequence. She woke before the light had fully formed, the room still holding the soft grey of early morning, and for a moment she lay still, aware of Oliver's quiet breathing near her feet, aware of the house around her, its familiar sounds, its steady presence, and of something else as well, something less tangible but equally real, a sense that the distance between what she had believed and what she now understood had narrowed in a way that would not easily reverse. When she rose, she did not go immediately to the diary. Instead, she moved through the house slowly, pausing in places she had passed countless times without notice, the hallway where the light now fell differently, the kitchen table where she had begun to read, the doorway between rooms where she found herself standing longer than necessary, her hand resting lightly against the frame. It was not hesitation, it was something closer to attention. In the kitchen, she prepared her tea, though she did not drink it right away, allowing it to sit as she stood by the window, looking out at the yard, where the fence now stood whole again, its line straight, its structure secure in a way that suggested permanence, though she knew, as Daniel had said, that wood did not remain unchanged forever. Oliver joined her, brushing lightly against her leg before settling nearby. "Yes," she said quietly, though the word held no clear direction. When she finally returned to the living room, the diary remained where she had left it, its presence no longer tentative, no longer something she approached with uncertainty, but something she accepted as part of what had become. She sat and opened it. There were only a few entries left. The one before her was dated not long before Evelyn's final days, though Margaret did not need the date to understand that it belonged to a time when something had already been recognized, even if it had not been resolved. The handwriting was steady, though slightly lighter, as if the act of writing required more care. "I have been thinking," Evelyn wrote, "of the life I have lived as it might appear to others, ordered, consistent, without visible deviation, and I understand now that this appearance has been both a comfort and a concealment." Margaret read the sentence slowly, her eyes moving with a kind of quiet steadiness that surprised her. She did not feel the same resistance she had before. "Only a growing clarity. I do not regret the choices I have made," the entry continued, "but I see now that they were not made in the absence of alternatives. There were moments, clear, present moments, in which I might have acted differently. I recognize them, and I chose not to. Margaret's breath slowed. She did not look away. There is a particular afternoon I return to, Evelyn wrote, though I have never spoken of it. It was not marked by anything that would have seemed significant from the outside. A conversation, brief and measured, an opportunity, quiet but unmistakable. I understood in that moment that speaking differently would alter not only what followed, but how I would be seen. I chose to remain as I had been. Margaret felt something settle into place within her, not as a shock, but as a recognition that had been forming all along. The unnamed encounter, the silence, the choice not taken. It was not necessary to know the details. The shape of it was enough. I have wondered at times, Evelyn continued, whether that choice preserved what I valued, or whether it prevented something else from becoming possible. I do not have an answer. I have lived the life that followed, and it has been, in many ways, a good one. But I understand now that goodness does not exclude incompleteness. Margaret closed the diary, her hands resting gently on its cover. The room was very still, and in that stillness she understood. Not everything, not fully, but enough. Her mother had not been the fixed, certain figure she had believed her to be. She had been a woman who saw, who hesitated, who chose, not always out of clarity, but sometimes out of a desire to preserve what already existed. And that choice, quiet and unspoken, had shaped the life Margaret had known. There was no betrayal in it, no dramatic revelation, only a complexity that had remained hidden, not because it was meant to deceive, but because it had never been brought into the open. Margaret rose, carrying the diary with her to the window. The light had begun to shift, the morning moving forward. She rested her hand against the glass, her reflection faint. For a moment she saw not only herself, but the space behind her, the room, the chair, the table where the diary had rested, all of it unchanged, and yet not the same. She thought then, not of what her mother had done, but of what she herself had carried forward from that life, the preference for quiet, the acceptance of what appeared settled, the instinct to preserve rather than to question. The realization came gently, and with it a sense that understanding did not require resolution, only acknowledgment. Behind her, Oliver shifted, his presence steady. Margaret did not turn. She remained there, her hand against the glass, aware that something had come into view, not fully, not completely, but enough to alter the way she would see what remained. The days that followed did not change in any outward way, and Margaret found, perhaps to her own quiet surprise, that she did not expect them to, nor did she feel any particular urgency to act upon what she had come to understand, as though the realization itself had completed something that did not require further demonstration, and she moved through her routines with a steadiness that felt both familiar and subtly altered, like a piece of music she had heard many times, but now listened to with a different attention. The diary remained in the living room, though no longer in the same place. Margaret had moved it to the small shelf near the window, not hidden, but not central either, as if it had found its position naturally, without insistence. She no longer read it each day. There were moments when she opened it, returning to certain passages, not to uncover something new, but to sit with what she had already encountered, allowing the words to settle into a quieter understanding. Other times she left it closed, and that too felt appropriate. Oliver continued his quiet movements through the house, his presence unchanged, though Margaret found herself noticing him more, noticing the way he paused before entering a room, the way he settled into places that seemed chosen not for comfort alone, but for their proximity to her. One afternoon, as she stood in the kitchen, she became aware of a sound that had always been there, but had never fully entered her attention, the faint, intermittent creak of the attic stairs, responding to shifts in the house that occurred without visible cause. She paused, her hand resting on the counter. For a moment she considered going up again, but she did not out of avoidance, simply because it was not necessary. The attic, like the diary, no longer held the same sense of distance. It had become part of the same understanding. Later that day she stepped outside, the air carrying a softness that suggested the season was turning more fully now, and she walked along the fence, her hand brushing lightly against the wood as she moved, feeling its solidity, its slight irregularities, the places where the grain rose just enough to be noticed. At the gate she paused, and this time, without deliberation, she opened it. The movement was small, almost incidental, and yet it carried a quiet significance, not because it marked a departure, but because it did not. She stepped onto the street. The town appeared as it always had, familiar, contained, its rhythm steady and unremarkable. A car passed, a neighbour nodded in recognition. The small store at the corner stood with its door slightly ajar, as though inviting entry without expectation. Margaret walked toward it, her pace unhurried. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of paper and wood, a mixture that reminded her unexpectedly of the attic, though the association did not trouble her. She moved through the aisles, selecting a few items, her attention drifting not to what she needed, but to the act of being there, of moving through a space that extended beyond the boundaries of her house. At the counter, she exchanged a few words with the clerk, the conversation brief, unremarkable, yet carrying a quiet ease that Margaret had not always allowed herself. When she stepped back outside, the light had shifted again, the afternoon beginning its gradual turn toward evening. She did not return home immediately. Instead, she stood for a moment on the sidewalk, her gaze moving along the street, taking in the small details she had passed so many times before without seeing them fully. A window slightly open, a curtain moving in the breeze, the distant sound of someone calling out, though the words did not carry clearly. These things did not form a pattern, and yet they felt, in some quiet way, connected. When she finally returned to the house, Oliver met her at the door, his presence immediate and familiar. "Well," she said softly, though the word carried no uncertainty now. Inside, the house held its usual quiet. The diary remained on the shelf. Margaret did not go to it. Instead, she moved through the rooms, turning on lights as the day faded, her action steady, unhurried. There was, she realized, a difference between knowing something and needing to act upon it. And for now, it was enough to know. The morning came much as it had before, with that same gradual unfolding of light that Margaret had learned over the years to meet without expectation, and she found herself once again at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that cooled more quickly than she anticipated, as though time, in its quiet persistence, continued to move just beyond her ability to hold it in place. The window carried its familiar distortion, bending the view of the street into that soft wavering she had come to rely on, and as she looked through it, she became aware of a small detail she had not noticed in some time. A single leaf caught near the edge of the curb, moving slightly with each passing breeze, though never quite leaving its place. Oliver sat nearby, his body still, his presence steady. Margaret reached down, her hand resting briefly against his back, feeling the warmth there, the quiet confirmation of something that did not require explanation. "Yes," she said, though the word was softer now, less a response than a recognition. The house around her held its usual sounds, the faint creak of the floorboards, the distant settling that occurred without visible cause, and she listened to them without trying to interpret them, allowing them to exist as they were. After a time she rose, carrying her cup to the sink, rinsing it, setting it aside with the same careful attention she had always given to such tasks. She moved then through the hallway, her steps measured, her hand brushing lightly against the wall as she passed, until she reached the living room. The diary remained on the shelf, its position unchanged. She looked at it for a moment, her gaze steady, not searching. Then, without hesitation, she approached it. She did not open it. Instead, she lifted it gently, her fingers resting along its worn edge, feeling the texture of the cover, the slight give of the pages within. For a moment she held it there, and then she placed it back, not exactly where it had been before, but slightly to the side, as though making room, not for something else, but for the space around it to exist more freely. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, yet it carried for her a quiet completeness. She turned then, moving toward the window, her reflection faint in the glass. Outside, the street remained unchanged. The same leaf still lingered near the curb, shifting slightly, its movement subtle but continuous. Margaret rested her hand against the pane, her gaze steady. She thought briefly of her mother, not as she had once remembered her, but as she had come to understand her now. Not entirely certain, not entirely resolved, but present in a way that did not require definition. There were things she would never know, moments that would remain unspoken, choices whose full meaning would never be entirely clear. And yet this absence no longer felt like something that needed to be filled. It was part of what remained. Behind her, Oliver moved, his steps soft against the floor. The house held its quiet. The light shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly. Margaret stood there for a while, her hand against the glass, her thoughts not forming into conclusions, but settling into something that felt, at last, like a kind of acceptance, not complete, not final, but sufficient. After a time she stepped back. The room remained as it was. The diary rested on the shelf. The day continued, and in that continuation Margaret moved forward, not towards something new, but within what had always been there, now seen with a clarity that did not erase its uncertainties, but allowed them to remain quietly as part of the whole.